The steering wheel felt like worn sandpaper under Miguel's calloused palms. Rain streaked the windshield of the sedan, distorting the neon signs of Riverbend into long, bleeding ribbons of amber and violet. Inside the cabin, the air smelled of stale coffee and the faint, lingering scent of pine-shaped air fresheners that had long since lost their potency. Miguel adjusted his posture, feeling the familiar ache in his lower back, a constant companion after 12 hours on the road. He watched the world through the rectangular frame of the rearview mirror. It was a filtered existence, observing the brief, frantic lives of strangers before they dissolved back into the dark. Since the divorce, the silence of his apartment had become a physical weight, driving him back to the driver's seat night after night. His own son was a fading voice on the other end of a monthly phone call, a teenager growing into a man Miguel no longer recognized. Here, in the dim glow of the dashboard, Miguel was nobody, and that suited him. The taxi sat idling near the curb of the community center. Through the fog glass of the building's windows, shadows danced to the muffled rhythm of a radio. It was a neighborhood social, the kind of gathering meant to patch together a sense of belonging in a city that felt increasingly cold. Miguel checked the app on his phone. No new calls. He leaned his head against the rest, closing his eyes for a second, listening to the rhythmic thrum of the engine. A soft tap on the passenger window startled him. Miguel flinched, glancing instinctively toward the community center entrance. Inside, a few adults had gone quiet. Not alarmed, just alert in the way people become when they recognize a problem they've learned not to touch. Miguel rolled it down, expecting a drunk reveler or a lost tourist. Instead, he found a boy. The child looked about 8, wearing a windbreaker zipped to the chin and clutching the straps of a heavy backpack. His eyes were wide, dark, and carried a focused intensity that didn't belong on such a young face. "Are you busy?" the boy asked, his voice thin but steady against the wind. Miguel shook his head slowly. "Waiting for a ride. You lost, kid." The boy took a shallow breath, glancing back toward the warm light of the center. "My name is Noah. I don't need a ride. I need you to come inside and say you're my dad. Just for a little bit." Miguel stared at the boy, his hand frozen on the window switch. In the reflection of the glass, he caught a glimpse of his own eyes, steady, alert, the same look he'd worn years ago before stepping between two men on a midnight platform, knowing one of them would walk away angry. The request hung in the damp air, absurd and heavy. He looked for a hidden camera or a parent lurking in the shadows, but there was only Noah, standing straight-backed while rain began to darken the shoulders of his jacket. "I can't do that, Noah," Miguel said, his voice lowering to a gravelly whisper. "I'm a driver. I'm just here for the work. Go find your mom." "She's the reason," Noah countered, his knuckles white against his backpack straps. He leaned closer, his gaze darting toward a tall man standing near the community center entrance, a man whose posture suggested a predatory kind of persistence. "That's Mr. Henderson," Noah said, his voice tightening. "He won't leave her alone. He always waits until people pretend not to notice. Last time, security only stepped in after it was too late. He keeps talking about the past, and my mom. She's shaking. She told him to stop, but he acts like he didn't hear her. If he thinks my dad is here, he'll go away." Miguel looked at the boy's shoes, scuffed sneakers, wet through. He thought of his own son, miles away, and the many times he had failed to be the shield his family needed. The institutional logic of his life told him to roll up the window. Involvement meant risk. It meant breaking the invisible wall that kept his life simple and numb. But Noah didn't move. He stood there with a quiet, desperate dignity, waiting for a stranger to prove that the world wasn't entirely indifferent. "Just 5 minutes," Noah pleaded. "If he sees me walk back alone, he won't stop." "Please." Miguel felt the click of the door handle in his hand before he fully processed the decision. The cost of a lost fare was nothing compared to the sudden, sharp pang of a dormant conscience. He turned off the engine, the sudden silence inside the car feeling louder than the rain. He stepped out, straightening his worn jacket. He wasn't a father to anyone lately, but as he followed the boy toward the light, he felt a strange, terrifying shift in his own gravity. The community center smelled of damp coats and cheap floor wax. Miguel followed Noah through the crowd, feeling the sudden heat of the room press against his skin. He felt like an intruder, a ghost stepping into a living room. Noah led him toward a corner, where a woman stood trapped between a folding table and a man who leaned too close, his hand resting on the wall, just above her shoulder. Elena Brooks looked exhausted. Her eyes were fixed on the floor, her fingers twisting a paper napkin into a tight braid. When Noah reached her, he grabbed Miguel's hand. The contact was electric, a small, warm palm signaling a silent pact. "Dad, you're finally here," Noah said, his voice loud enough to cut through the surrounding chatter. The man, Henderson, straightened up, his face reddening as he sized Miguel up. Miguel didn't puff out his chest or raise his voice. He simply stood there, keeping his hand firmly in Noah's, allowing the silence to do the heavy lifting. He looked at Elena, seeing the moment of confusion in her eyes turn into a flicker of realization, then profound relief. "Traffic was bad," Miguel said quietly, nodding to Elena. He turned his gaze toward Henderson, a steady, unblinking stare. "We're ready to go soon, aren't we?" Henderson cleared his throat, his bravado wilting under the weight of a man who looked like he had seen far worse than a neighborhood bully. "I didn't know you were expected," Henderson muttered, stepping back and smoothing his shirt. He lingered for a second, searching for a crack in the lie, but Miguel remained a solid, immovable presence. Without another word, Henderson turned and vanished into the crowd. Elena let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for a year. She looked at Miguel, then at her son, her hand trembling as she tucked a stray hair behind her ear. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely audible over the music. Miguel simply nodded, the weight of the boy's hand still grounding him to the floor. The aftermath of the lie didn't bring a clean exit. Instead, the room seemed to tighten around them, sealing the three of them into a strange, artificial bubble. Neighbors who had previously ignored Elena now approached, their eyes curious, directed toward the man they assumed was the ghost of her past returned to the flesh. A few glances flicked toward the exit, as if someone were silently deciding whether this situation required intervention or gossip. Elena moved toward the coat rack, her movements jerky and uncertain. "We should leave," she murmured, but a woman from the neighborhood committee intercepted them, holding out 2 plastic cups of lukewarm punch. "Noah never mentioned you were back in town," the woman said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Her gaze dropped briefly to Miguel's worn boots, the faint grease stain on his cuff. The judgment was silent but sharp, a weighing of his worth against the polished standards of the community, the kind of verdict that never needed to be spoken to still be enforced. Miguel felt the old instinct to retreat, to dissolve back into the anonymity of the driver's seat, where no one asked questions and no one expected permanence. He looked at Elena. She was pale, her eyes darting toward the exit, yet she didn't pull away. Her shoulder brushed against his, a quiet refusal to be displaced. "I've been away a long time," Miguel said, his voice steady. He didn't offer an explanation. He didn't defend himself. He held the plastic cup like it carried weight. He realized then that the lie had stripped away his invisibility. There would be no clean ending now. Whatever happened next would follow him, whether he stayed or walked away. Across the room, Henderson lingered near the refreshments table, whispering something to a man beside him. He smiled the way men do when they haven't lost, only postponed something. Miguel felt Noah lean against his leg. The child's weight was slight, but grounding. He stayed where he was, anchored by the quiet understanding that for this boy, the father had to be real, even if that reality came with a cost Miguel hadn't yet calculated. The drive back to their apartment unfolded in near silence. Rain whispered against the roof of the taxi, the rhythmic swish of the wipers marking time. Noah had fallen asleep in the back seat, his head resting against the cold glass, breath slow and even. Elena sat rigid in the passenger seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The taxi, once a place of passing strangers, felt heavier now, charged with the aftermath of something that couldn't be undone. When Miguel pulled up to the curb of the aging brick building, he killed the headlights, but left the engine running. Warmth lingered in the cabin. Elena didn't reach for the door right away. She turned toward him, her face lit by the muted green glow of the taximeter. "You didn't have to stay," she said quietly. "I saw how they looked at you. People like that, they decide who belongs very quickly." Miguel studied his hands on the steering wheel. I've spent a lot of years being someone nobody understands, he replied. It didn't feel much different. She hesitated, then spoke again, softer. Noah thinks you're a hero. She glanced toward the back seat. But I know what I asked of you. I saw your face when he tapped on your window. You weren't just helping us. You were running from something, too. The words landed with a weight Miguel hadn't braced for. Not an accusation, recognition. He thought of unanswered messages, a son growing older without him, miles of road driven to avoid standing still. I'm just a driver, he said, though the sentence rang hollow even to him. Elena opened the door. Tonight, she replied. You were exactly who we needed. She gathered Noah gently and disappeared into the building. Miguel sat there longer than necessary, listening to the engine idle, aware that something fundamental had shifted. The lie hadn't ended the danger. It had simply changed its shape. The days that followed fell into a pattern that felt both natural and dangerous. Miguel found himself circling their neighborhood during his shifts, the magnetic pull of the brick building stronger than the promise of airport fares. He told himself it was coincidence. But patterns were dangerous things. Sooner or later, someone would notice he was no longer just passing through. He began stopping by, not as a pretender, but as a man offering quiet presence. He fixed a leaking faucet, the metallic clink of his tools echoing softly in a kitchen that had grown used to silence. He repaired a cabinet hinge, working slowly, deliberately. Noah sat on the counter, watching every movement. My real dad used to say that if you fix things right the first time, they stay fixed, the boy said, almost to himself. Miguel paused, fingers resting against the worn wood. He thought of all the things he hadn't fixed in his own life. Bridges left unattended until they collapsed under their own neglect. He was right, Miguel said. But sometimes things break because they've been used too long. That doesn't mean they aren't worth keeping. Elena stood in the doorway, a laundry basket balanced against her hip. She watched in silence. Her life had been built on careful rules, self-reliance, distance, control. Miguel's presence wasn't dramatic. It didn't demand space, and that somehow made it more disruptive. She saw now that he wasn't trying to replace what she had lost. He was simply refusing to disappear. And Miguel understood something just as quietly. By staying, he wasn't just helping them. He was stepping into a life that would eventually ask something back. The call from the school came on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of call that never brings good news. Elena recognized the number immediately, and before she answered, her chest tightened with a familiar dread, the sense that something fragile was about to be tested by people who only understood order on paper. Noah hadn't started the fight. That much was clear. A boy had laughed, loud enough for others to hear, calling Miguel a rent-a-dad, a temporary figure hired to play a role. Noah reacted the way children do when something precious is mocked before they fully understand how to defend it, with his fists instead of his words. Miguel arrived at the school just as Elena did, his taxi still humming at the curb, the meter switched off without thought. Inside the principal's office, the air was sterile and sharp, thick with the scent of lemon cleaner and authority. They sat in small plastic chairs that seemed designed to remind adults of their place. The administrator across from them didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her eyes moved calmly between Elena's exhausted posture and Miguel's grease-marked jacket. A thin folder rested in her hands, heavy with implication. There's confusion in our records, she said. The boy's father. These inconsistencies matter. For safety. For policy. The word policy landed harder than accusation ever could. Elena's fingers twisted around the strap of her purse. She stared at the floor, heat rising to her face. She had broken a rule once, out of fear, not deceit, and now the system was reminding her that survival did not excuse deviation. She felt the old shame resurface, sharp and public. Miguel felt the pull to disappear. He could end this easily. One sentence would restore order. I'm just the driver. He had spent years perfecting that invisibility. People like him were tolerated best when they asked for nothing and claimed no space. The principal's gaze lingered on him a second too long, already forming a conclusion. Miguel leaned forward, not dramatically, not defiantly, simply enough to occupy the room. He's my responsibility, he said. No paperwork, no speech, just the truth, placed carefully on the table. If there's a problem, he continued, voice steady, you call me. I'm here. I'm the one who stays. Silence followed, not agreement but hesitation, the kind that appears when rules meet something they weren't designed to contain. Elena looked up. In that moment, the fear in her eyes gave way to something deeper, recognition. Under fluorescent lights and institutional judgment, Miguel crossed a line he couldn't uncross. He didn't claim a title. He claimed a duty. And the room felt different after that. Nothing changed all at once. There was no announcement. No clear turning point the world could label. Instead, Miguel's life shifted through small decisions that quietly stacked on top of each other. He kept showing up, not because of the lie anymore, but because the silence of his taxi felt heavier than the noise of a shared kitchen. One morning, on his first free day in weeks, he stood in a hardware store aisle longer than necessary, running his fingers over planks of cedar as if choosing something sacred. 3 nights later, his garage smelled of sawdust and old oil as he sanded a birdhouse smooth enough to erase splinters. He brought it over without explanation. On the back porch, Miguel and Noah worked side by side, the air sharp with approaching winter. The boys' hands were careful, deliberate. Miguel noticed how Noah's shoulders, once permanently tense, had begun to settle. He guided without taking control, corrected without correcting the boy himself. They spoke little. They didn't need to. Elena watched from the steps, mugs of tea steaming in her hands. She noticed the difference immediately, not grand gestures, but consistency. The way Miguel showed up when promised. The way he listened more than he spoke. The way Noah no longer scanned rooms for exits. Recognition came quietly, too. It was the porch light left on during Miguel's late shifts. A soft yellow signal cutting through Riverbend's industrial gloom. It told him something no one had said aloud yet. You are expected. One night, sitting alone in his taxi, Miguel did something he hadn't allowed himself to do in years. He called his own son. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain. He stayed on the line and listened for 40 minutes. For the first time, Miguel wasn't a ghost in someone else's life. He was present, and presence. He was learning. Changed things faster than promises ever had. The frost arrived late in November, thin patterns of ice crawling across the taxi windows, like quiet warnings. Miguel knew the routines now, the creaking stair, the stubborn faucet, how Noah liked his toast burned just enough to complain about it. At the school winter pageant, he stood at the back of the room, worn jacket among pressed suits. He felt out of place. Yet when the lights dimmed and the children stepped onto the stage, that feeling dissolved into something steadier. Noah scanned the crowd and found him. The boy's face lit up, not with relief, but with pride. He wasn't searching for someone temporary. He was looking for his person. That look did something final inside Miguel. After the show, cold wind cutting through the parking lot, Noah reached for Miguel's sleeve. You're coming back tomorrow, right? It wasn't fear asking. It was expectation. Miguel knelt, tying the scarf carefully, the pavement biting into his knees. I'll be there. Elena stood nearby, streetlight mist framing her smile, tired, real-earned. They weren't perfect. Their scars still ached. But they had chosen each other deliberately, against convenience, against rules written for easier lives. Miguel walked toward the car holding Elena's hand, no longer driving aimlessly through the city. For the first time, he wasn't looking for a destination. He had arrived.